Hi, I'm Dr. Russ, and this is Unit 9, Draft the Introduction. Well, congratulations. We've spent half a semester planning the paper out in very careful detail. And hopefully, this will have a big payoff that after doing so much planning, it should be fairly easy to write a good paper. So this week, we're going to draft the introduction to the paper. Let's see how that's done. In this video, we're going to talk about drafting a paper and then writing the introduction to the paper. We'll go through a 5-step process for writing the introduction, and then we'll look at this week's assignment. The goal for this unit is on your own. You will be able to draft the introductory paragraph or paragraphs for your paper using an outline. We have finished the pre-writing stage and now we begin the draft stage. The draft stage involves writing the introduction, writing the body paragraphs, and writing the conclusion. And this week we're just going to write the introduction. The goal of the draft stage is simply to write a complete draft. It's to give structure to your writing, and you'll use your outline as a framework for that structure. You'll make sure that each paragraph has a clear central focus that relates to your overall argument. When you move on to a different topic, you'll start a new paragraph. You'll use appropriate transition words and phrases to show the connections between your ideas. And I want to emphasize there's no need to make everything perfect as you go along. We will make the paper perfect in later stages. Right now, the goal is just to get everything on paper or in your computer. We're not worrying about spelling or grammar or punctuation or anything else. We're just trying to get the content in the paper during the draft stage. So let's look at how we write the introduction. We hook the reader. We give background information. We present the thesis statement for the paper. We map out or describe the essay's structure, and then we check and revise the introduction. So the very first sentence of the very first paragraph is called the hook. A hook should lead the reader into the essay, give them a sense of the topic that you're writing about, and show why the topic is interesting. Start with something that is clear, concise, and catchy that will spark your reader's curiosity. But avoid overly broad claims or plain statements of fact. Okay, let's look at some examples of writing a good hook. First, let's start with a bad example. Braille was an extremely important invention. That sentence is just a dry fact. It's not very interesting, and it's a very broad statement. Now let's look at a good example. The invention of Braille was a major turning point in the history of disability. That sentence is much more interesting it makes a bold claim about exactly why the topic is important. Here's another bad example. The internet is defined as a global computer network providing a variety of information and communication facilities. Don't use dictionary definitions as your hook. For one thing, that's boring. And again, if it's obvious that everyone knows what it means, you're just wasting their time. Here's a good example. The spread of the internet has had a world-changing event, not least on the world of education. Okay, this one is better. It's still kind of broad, but it gives a much clearer sense of what the essay will be about. Let's look at a couple more examples. A bad hook. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a famous book from the 19th century. If you're an English major or if you just read a lot, everybody knows that. That's not telling anybody anything they don't already know. So it makes a bad hook. Now let's look at a good example. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is often read as a crude cautionary tale about the dangers of scientific advancement. Okay, just the way that's worded, they both talk about how most people understand that book, but they're also hinting that they might talk about the book in a different way. So that makes it interesting. The next step in writing your introduction is to give some background information. We call that context. So you should always give your reader some context so that they can understand your topic and your argument. Depending upon the subject of the essay, the context might include a historical, geographical, or social context, an outline of the debate you're addressing, a summary of relevant theories or research about the topic, or definitions of key terms. Context information should still be broad, but yet it should be clearly focused and relevant to your argument. Don't give too much detail because that will happen later in the paper. But mention points that you're going to return to later in the paper. Save all the evidence and interpretation for the body. This is a great example of giving background information because it talks a little bit about where Braille was at that point in time, what people thought about blind people, and a little bit about the idea of people using their fingers to read. Next, present the thesis statement. This helps you to narrow your focus. So remember, the thesis statement presents your own position in a debate or your central point about a topic. And in this course, you've already written it. The thesis statement is generally one sentence long, although sometimes it can be 2 sentences long. Remember that a good thesis statement makes a claim that requires evidence and explanation. And all that evidence and explanation is something you'll present later in the body. It shows exactly what you want to say about the topic, and it's not just a statement of fact. So here is yet another example of a good thesis statement. As the first writing system designed for blind people's needs, Braille was a groundbreaking new accessibility tool. It not only provided practical benefits, but also helped change the cultural status of blindness. Next, Map the essay's structure. In other words, for longer essays, finish your introduction by describing what will be covered in each part. Keep it very brief and help your reader understand the direction your argument is going to take. Let's look at an example. This essay begins by discussing the situation of blind people in 19th century Europe. It then describes the invention of Braille and the gradual process of its acceptance within blind education. Subsequently, it explores the wide-ranging events of this invention on blind people's social and cultural lives. So now, in those few sentences, we have a really good idea of what's going to happen as we read the rest of the paper. And finally, for quality purposes, you want to check and revise your introduction. Whenever you work on any part of a paper, whether it's earlier when you were looking up sources, or even now as you're starting to write, your paper might change focus or direction as you learn more. And that's okay. When you've finished writing the essay body and conclusion, go back and check the introduction. And make sure that the introduction matches the content of the essay and that the thesis statement accurately represents what you do in the essay. Now, when we're talking about that kind of check, remember we said in a previous unit that you don't necessarily write things down in the same order that they are in the outline. In your final paper, they're in the same order as the outline, but you might actually jump all around as you're writing. Because the introduction is supposed to reflect the whole paper, you might wait until last to write your introduction. Then again, you may choose to write the introduction first, just to make sure that you yourself are clear on where you're going in the paper. Different people do it different ways. Try it both ways and see which works best for you. Anyhow, if you find that your argument has gone in a different direction than what you originally planned, revise the thesis statement to reflect what the body and conclusion said. And now let's go over the assignment. You will demonstrate that you can draft an introduction for the paper. So start out by reviewing your thesis statement and your outline. Get those in your head. Then, as we saw earlier in the video, write a hook to get your reader's attention. The hook should introduce the topic and explain why the topic is interesting. Write any background information you think the reader needs to understand the topic. Include the thesis statement in the introduction to narrow the paper from the broad topic background to the central point. Write an overview to show the reader where the essay is going. For example, first, da 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 da, then da 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 da, third, da 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 da, after that, da 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 da, and finally, da da da. But don't copy this example. Use your own words. And remember, academic writing is not personal, so you won't be saying something like, first I'm going to do this, or first I'm going to do that. And you won't say things like, first you're going to read about, or first you're going to read about. It's impersonal. Then submit the assignment to your instructor. So how will we evaluate the introduction? We'll make sure it has a hook to introduce the topic and to explain why the topic is interesting. We'll make sure the introduction has background information to help the reader understand the topic. We'll make sure the introduction includes the thesis statement to narrow the paper from the broad topic background to the central point. We'll check to see if the introduction has an overview that shows where the essay is going. And finally, we'll make sure you submitted the assignment by the due date. As always, if you have any questions, please ask your instructor or lab assistant.